as a conscious being, the more you recognize, like just intuitively and automatically, the consciousness of other beings. And the more likely you are to be connected with your compassion for them, because you feel this interconnection, you experience this interconnection. If we look at the most pressing problems in the world and also in our individual lives, like unjust wars and poverty, animal exploitation, climate change, racism, patriarchy, we can see that they all share a common denominator: relational dysfunction, dysfunctional ways of relating, right? Between social groups, between individuals, among, smaller groups, between humans and non-human animals, between humans and the environment. Then a common denominator in resolving these problems or addressing these problems is building relational literacy, which is the understanding of and ability to practice healthy ways of relating.
Good afternoon, Melanie. How are you?
I am really happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Jamie. How are you?
Yeah, great. It's brilliant to get the chance to talk to you. So many of my guests have obviously cited your work and talked about you as an influencer. It's brilliant to have you join me here. And it's good timing with the latest book project and other web projects that you're launching at the moment too. So,
yeah, thank you.
And I've already apologized for sitting at a slightly odd angle because Luna here has insisted on coming to join us. So she may interrupt the interview at some point, but we'll see. You know this already, but I guess this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest philosophical questions and the most important ones. Questions of what's real and how should we go about understanding this amazing universe we all share. But just as importantly, the questions of ethics, what matters and who matters. And then in the final section, okay, what are we going to do about that to try and make things better? And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop this really pluralistic worldview that I'm calling Sentientism, which suggests that when it comes to the what's real question, we should take a broadly naturalistic approach using evidence and reason with a healthy dash of humility to try and understand reality as well as we can. And then when it comes to the ethical questions, the clue is in the name, that every sentient being, any being that has the capacity to value itself, to experience anything, should count as a serious moral patient, whatever ethical system we then apply. So I summarize it as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. But I talk to people in this series whether or not they agree with that philosophy. So it's going to be great to sort of dig into your philosophical journey, but how that underpins your life's work and how you think we can make a better future too. But before we get on to those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself for people who don't know of you already? And I don't know if you also want to introduce the book and just say a few words about that.
Melanie Joy, and I'm an author. I've written 7 books, and we'll talk a little bit about my newest book, How to End Injustice Everywhere. And I'm a psychologist. My area of specialization has been looking at the psychology of violence and nonviolence broadly, a little bit more specifically, the psychology of oppression and social transformation. And more specifically, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on one aspect of this, which is the psychology of eating animals. And I'm the founding president of the NGO Beyond Carnism. The work that we do at the organization is to raise awareness of Carnism. We'll talk about this a little bit, I'm sure, the invisible belief system that conditions people to eat certain animals and provide, tools in order to help be active in this transformation. So we have our Center for Effective Vegan Advocacy, which really trains people who want to raise awareness of this issue of eating animals and carnism, and help them to do that more effectively.
That's brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much. Well, let's dive straight into the big philosophical questions. And the first one is, I summarize as what's real, but it's more broadly about epistemology and how do we work out what's real. And for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up originally in maybe in a more religious or supernatural or spiritual context in terms of family and society, or one that was maybe more atheistic or scientific or naturalistically minded, and how that side of their thinking has changed over time, if it has, on the sort of big questions about the nature of reality and how best to understand it. So you can wind the clock back as far as you're comfortable to sort of tell the story and explain how you think about that stuff now.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's a very good question. When I was, very young, my family, we went to a Presbyterian church. We rarely went to church, but when we did, it was Presbyterian. And my father had been Catholic and my mother was Protestant, and neither of them were terribly religious, actually, but this is actually relevant for later in my life. But both of them, I mean, this was back in the 60s and early 70s. So I went to a Presbyterian nursery school, actually, and then we went sort of occasionally to church. And that was my sort of first introduction to what, we could call spiritual and, these bigger questions, I guess. Later on, my parents divorced fairly early on. My father married a Jewish woman. And they later, over the years, he was not religious at all. And she was not really religious, but she was Jewish and somewhat practicing. And then about a decade after they were married, my father started to become very religious, very Catholic, like kind of rediscovered his Catholic roots. And his wife my stepmother ended up converting to Catholicism. And then they sort of became, quite active, actually, Catholics, actively practicing Catholics. And my mother became part of the Unitarian Universalist Church. And that was very interesting to me. All of this was very interesting to me. So I wasn't religious myself. I was never religious myself, but I was very interested in religion. So much so that when I went to college, my first major was comparative religious ethics. Fascinated by all things spiritual. It was like the 70s, and I was fascinated by the occult and, just doing a lot of my own reading. And so I went to Catholic Church. I was sort of very interested in Judaism for a while, and not becoming a practitioner, but these were kind of orienting me. I was asking questions. I was always asking, about meaning and what's true and what's real. It was sort of the way that my brain was wired, I think. Or just whatever, my psyche was wired. And I was partially raised by my aunt and uncle who were Quakers, and they were very active in the Quaker church, and, have Quaker meetings. We would have, Quaker events, Quaker weddings, Quaker funerals. I was also very interested in Quakerism. I don't know how familiar you are with it. It's quite similar to Unitarian Universalism, and both of those traditions really appealed to me because they're very progressive and socially engaged, and they have a very strong social justice orientation and foundation. And my father and his wife are conservative and were conservative. They became increasingly conservative, not surprisingly. Everybody else in my family, and it's quite a large family, is very progressive. I think my grandfather was even a communist, or at the very least a socialist. And so this is the side of the family that was practicing Quakerism and Unitarian Universalism and very much integrating this sort of spiritual orientation, which wasn't believing in a God, but believing in something more, that has to be socially engaged. That was very attractive to me. And so, but I eventually got much more interested in and engaged with Buddhism. And I would say that has provided me, I'm not a Buddhist. I haven't actually trained under a Buddhist, teacher, but I have been guided by the principles of Buddhism. And more recently, I guess, let me just kind of skip ahead. So this is all like young adulthood. I would say that my learning and my understanding of the world has been very much informed by sort of witnessing and observing my family and the way that they understood their own traditions and their own practices and talked about them, and actually liking to be in churches and liking to be in synagogues and wanting to be in like temples, because I felt I felt very drawn. And this combination of sort of all of these various sort of dabbling in various religions and reading, the Tao Te Ching and the various religious texts, kind of combined with my study of psychology, has very much shaped the way that I think of the world and what I sort of accept as I don't even want to say true, because I don't even like that word, but very much shaped my orientation to the world. And I think where I've ultimately landed, and, if I answer what is real, what it is today will be a little bit different than what it would have been, a couple of years ago, because I've been deeply influenced by Sam Harris. And I would basically quote him: the only thing that we can know for sure is real is consciousness, like the fact that we are conscious beings. And his work, Waking Up, I have a fairly robust meditation practice, and I very much follow, his basically Sam Harris's teachings, but also some of the people that I have learned about from him, Adyashanti and Stephen Bodian and Locke Kelly, and sort of like non-dual awareness teachers. And they would, I think, all say the same thing. What we know for sure is real is the fact that we're conscious. And this is, I believe the Buddha actually also said this.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a fascinating journey. It's interesting that you were drawn to explore those things and even studied those things, because for some of my guests, as children, they just sort of look at the adults around them going, why is this stuff interesting? But for you, it was something that, drew you in and fascinated you. And I think there's a lot to like for me in the Buddhist way of thinking, and also in that stance you described, where our consciousness is central. Another sort of ancient version of that was Descartes' starting point of, I think, therefore I am, or, in a more Buddhist sense, it's an experience that is central, and that's the only thing we can be confident of. But I guess there's still an openness there to recognize that while our consciousness might be the only thing we're completely confident of, it can, through our experience, give us some confidence there is an outside world that's out there, probably, and we can build knowledge about that. And that's one of the things I'm interested in, is as we look at these different religious ways of thinking or supernatural ways of thinking, sometimes we can split the explicitly supernatural pieces off from, I guess, the ethics and the way they think. So personally, I'm quite drawn to a sort of Buddhist way of thinking that recognizes the centrality of consciousness and the importance of suffering and, different ways of managing that. I don't find the supernatural bits of it about, reincarnation or the more esoteric stuff factually convincing at all. So how do you think about this explicitly supernatural bits of those worldviews? Because they can come through, some Buddhists genuinely hold supernatural beliefs, and some people who take that sort of consciousness-centered meditation approach also see that actually in a supernatural sense, where their consciousness, is a window to things that are beyond the natural too. So my sense of those things is I feel quite a lot of affinity with them, but still from a very naturalistic standpoint that ultimately thinks I'm, just another evolved ape staggering around trying to understand the world. Other people look at those schools of thought and do think of them in a more transcendent supernatural sense. How do you feel about those?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say that Descartes, I don't think was expressing consciousness. He was expressing thinking, which is not what, the way that I'm describing consciousness, it's not thinking, it's actually beyond thought. And sort of using Sam Harris's and the Buddhist sort of definition of consciousness, it's the experience of being aware, but it's not the experience of thinking per se. In fact,
it's the raw awareness itself.
It's the raw it's the raw aliveness within us. It's undefined, undefinable. And in answer to your question, I don't have. My thinking is open. I'm open-minded. I don't know. I don't know what's true supernaturally. I don't follow supernatural phenomena. It's not what I like about Buddhism, and not religious Buddhism, but pure Buddhism, without the sort of religious bells and whistles and rituals and supernatural beliefs, is the fact that it is very rational. In fact, it's probably the most rational practice I've ever experienced. And so I do like this sort of this dual nature of rationality and awareness that consciousness does exist. And there's a lot we don't know. I'm open-minded, and I would never purport to say that what I'm saying is right or true. It's just my path has led me to a place where my practice is one in which I believe that the only thing I can know for sure is real is that I am a conscious being, and the consciousness exists because I'm conscious. I don't know anything beyond that. And I'm open to pretty much anything, but my own practice is not one that's engaged with supernatural phenomena. My practice is one that's engaged with deepening my experience of consciousness and expanding my experience of consciousness, and working to support the end of suffering for all conscious beings and sentient beings.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that helps clarify it, because there are some people who will take that, the only thing I know is my consciousness, and we'll take it to an extreme of solipsism that says maybe that's the only thing that exists. Some people will sort of deny the existence of the external reality at all. And that, I don't think that's your stance. You're like, that's the only thing I'm 100% confident of. But I'm also very confident there is an outside world with beings that warrant justice and that we should care about and that we should engage with. It's not a solipsistic view. It's just saying my awareness and my consciousness is where I start from, and everything comes through that. Is that
right? And the more you practice, the more you connect with your own experience of your consciousness, and get out of your head and into sort of the raw, deeper experience of being more present as a conscious being. The more you recognize, like just intuitively and automatically, the consciousness of other beings, and the more likely you are to be, to be connected with your compassion for them, because you feel this interconnection, you experience this interconnection.
Yeah, thank you. So that links into the next topic we'll discuss, which is the ethics and who should we care about and why should we care about. And before we come on to that, the question of supernatural and religion and so on obviously looms large when you think about epistemology, just because it's so societally resonant. But actually, you can draw epistemology into very practical topics as well. And one of the quotes I love from your book was something along the lines of, one of the key aims of justice movements is to debunk myths. And this is one of the reasons why I focus quite hard on epistemology, because I think, one, the better your epistemology is, the better chance you've got of actually being right about reality and understanding it. And if we want to make reality better, it's useful to understand it. So it's a purely pragmatic thing. That's why I think using evidence and reason is a pretty good starting point. I haven't come across a better one yet. But it's also because I think that if your epistemology is flawed, if there are myths or false narratives or fabrications or dogmas, they can actually have directly negative ethical impacts too. And we can see that clearly in the animal ethics space. I'd argue the idea of humane animal agriculture is an epistemological failure more than an ethical failure. It's just a misunderstanding of the facts. You can look at, QAnon and conspiracy theories and anti-vax and various other political movements that are going and social movements that are happening now that, again, seem to be more about broken epistemology than they are an ethical failing. So I was interested in your thoughts about how, if we're thinking about social justice and we're thinking about taking a more relational approach, as you describe in your book, in what way do facts and evidence and, understanding of reality, how do those play into the imperatives, the ethical imperatives we need to think about, and the social justice imperatives we need to think about?
I mean, they're important. There's no question. And more often than not, the facts don't sell the ideology. And, this is where a relational approach is really important, or at least an understanding of relationality is really, really important. And there are people have very different personality types. Our brains are wired very different from one another. And somebody who is like a highly rational person has always been that way and is like just a core value of theirs is truth and rationality. Maybe, not always, but maybe swayed by facts. But there are many people for whom, rationality is probably a value, but not that high up. And there are many people who are nevertheless so deeply entrenched in their own attachment to certain beliefs and behaviors that no matter how rational they are, no matter how rational you are with them, you will, when you're communicating with them, you may never reach them, right? So, look at how many people continue to eat. Like brilliant rationalists, who are also humanists, continue to eat animals in face of like overwhelming evidence.
Sam Harris being one frustrating example.
Yeah, I don't know what Sam Harris's experience is, with eating animals, or what his relationship with eating animals is. I haven't looked into it. I haven't asked, but I wouldn't be surprised because most people do. And and this is what I'm saying, that we all have our blind spots, and, people are not, even the most rational of us, is not necessarily going to be swayed by facts, because we're psychological beings. We're not just rational beings. And this is why it's so important to understand how to relate to other people, others in general, but other people we're talking about here, so that you can create connections and communicate in a way. Communication is the primary way we relate, that increase the chances that your message will be heard the way that you intend it to be, and really understand why it is that, people cling to certain attitudes and behaviors that, seems logical for them to be, or irrational for them to be clinging to.
I'd argue that taking that relational approach, one, it's more pragmatically useful because you're not going to have a constructive engagement with somebody unless you think in that way, whether your aim is to persuade or to understand things yourself. It's going to be difficult for you to learn from other people unless you take that relational approach. So again, that limits your own epistemology if you're not really genuinely open and listening to others. So I think that plays in really nicely. But it does feel that sometimes there can be a danger in a very strongly relational approach because it centers the perspective of individuals to such a degree it can start to deny the existence of an objective reality or open up space for people to go into worlds of fabrication or dogma, that then it's a little difficult to challenge if we're so respectful of their positionality, we're not able to undermine it with evidence and reason. And I guess this might be a little contentious to pick them out as examples, but there are some public figures, and I would argue that Robert Kennedy Jr. and people like Marianne Williamson might fall into this camp, where the surface message they're sharing is actually sounds very relational. It sounds like love and care for each other and doing the right thing. But when you scratch underneath the surface, there are some actually very broken and very harmful epistemologies, which are ultimately leading people back to almost a solipsistic selfishness that's very focused on the individual rather than it being a relational stance. So again, I shouldn't blather on too much, but how do we get that balance right?
Well, I think it's a false dichotomy, for one. Relational by definition is not individual. So it is, and I'll explain the way that I'm defining relational. We're not talking about the content. So if you're talking about a relational approach, but underneath the surface, the content of what somebody is talking about or promoting is not relational, then that's, the process might be relational, but the content is not. So why don't I define how I use relational in my work and in the book, and then we can kind of pick up the conversation from there, because I think you'll see that the more relational one is, the more likely they are to be making decisions that are in the interest of the greater good of the relationship, the greater good of the community, the greater good of the world, the greater good of, the collective, whatever that collective may be.
And by definition, that must mean those decisions are grounded in an understanding of reality as it is, not a reality that happens to be fabricated or arbitrarily constructed.
Well, let me explain, and then you can come back and we can see what you think. I mean, people can, so when I'm talking about relational, I'm talking about a process, right? The process, and people can engage in a relational process, but their facts might not be right. In the book, and How to End Injustice Everywhere, and in my other writing and work, a lot of the work that I do focuses on promoting healthy relationality. And this people are probably familiar with through my book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. So if we look at the most pressing problems in the world and also in our individual lives, like unjust wars and poverty, animal exploitation, climate change, racism, patriarchy, and toxic workplaces, abusive relationships, and so on, we can see that they all share a common denominator. And there are multiple common denominators, but the one I'm talking about here, which I think is fundamental, critically important, I would say, is relational dysfunction, dysfunctional ways of relating, right? Between social groups, between individuals, among, smaller groups, between humans and non-human animals, between humans and the environment. And we could even go so far as to say between us and ourselves, because our primary relationship is with ourselves. We're always relating to ourselves through our self-talk or the choices that we make that impact our future selves, for example, right? So, and if given that relational dysfunction is a common denominator driving these problems and driving injustice, in general, then a common denominator in resolving these problems or addressing these problems is building relational literacy, which is the understanding of and ability to practice healthy ways of relating. And so, when I'm talking about building relational literacy, it involves a number of principles and tools, of course. It's not rocket science, though. But all of these principles and tools are based on one formula. And when I was writing my book, Getting Relationships Right, which preceded How to End Injustice Everywhere, it was really meant to be a one-stop guide to building relational literacy. I just did a deep dive. I had been working in the relationship space for a very long time. It was sort of another hat that I wore that I was not really that engaged with anymore when I sunk into my work with Why We Love Dogs and Beyond Carnism, but I had been in that space for a long time and a psychologist. And I just did another deep dive into all things relationship and relational, and really asked what is at the core. Like if we really wanted to sort of peel the onion of a healthy relationship, what would we find at the core? Not the 10 principles of like how to treat your partner, but what is this? And I came up with what I call the formula for healthy relating. If you look at what all of the literature is saying, all the research is saying, and the formula for healthy relating basically is a formula for how to be like relational. And this is the formula. This applies to every interaction, every communication. Communication, as I've said, is a primary way we relate, every relationship, including our relationship with other animals. This formula applies across the board. So in a healthy interaction or relationship, we practice integrity and we honor dignity. And I'm going to unpack these for listeners. And this leads to a sense of greater connection and security. Now, integrity is, by definition, right, the integration of our core values and practices. And people have a lot of different values, but research has shown that, there are certain core moral values that are espoused across cultures. And the two most consistent and commonly held ones are compassion and justice, which is basically kindness and fairness, right? So practicing integrity is practicing compassion and justice. And we could simplify this even further. It's practicing what we would call respect, treating someone else the way you would want to be treated if you were in their position.
And are those things, I guess, the core of what you think are the answer to our second question of, ultimately what matters? It comes back to questions of justice and compassion. Is that the core?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so this is my guiding principle is I am guided by the formula, essentially, but practicing healthy relationality. So when you practice integrity and you honor someone's dignity, dignity is one sense of inherent worth. And that means you perceive of this other individual, as being having fundamental worth. It's being no less worthy of being treated with respect or occupying the space on this planet than anyone else. When you practice dignity, integrity, and honor dignity, this leads to a greater sense of security and connection between you. And of course, the opposite is also true, right? When you violate integrity and harm dignity, this leads to insecurity and disconnection. And we know that secure connection is like the foundation of healthy human development and healthy human relating. And so it all comes back to this formula. And if we ask ourselves, back to your question, can being relational make you too individualistic? Well, no. I mean, it can't, because the whole point of practicing healthy relationality, it's practicing the formula. It's always asking, whether you're talking about how you're treating another person or how a system is operating, what reflects integrity and honors dignity? And that guiding question will lead you to the conclusion. It's not always that straightforward. Obviously, there are knotty questions to unravel, and a lot of times we can't answer that question. But if this is your guiding question, what is the practice? What is the path of integrity? And am I honoring dignity, the dignity of the individuals involved in this system here? Then that will guide you to making decisions that are in the best interest of the relationship, which means of yourself and of the other person or the system.
Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense. And I think your way of describing that formula would absolutely challenge and cut through someone who's pretending to take a relational approach but actually isn't, because your formula puts at its heart a sense of justice, a sense of compassion that is by definition about the dignity and the value of others. I mean, it's absolutely central to it. It can't slip back into being something that's more solipsistic or something that's more individualistic.
I mean, people can believe in myths and practice the formula. The formula is a process. It's like how, you relate. People can have misunderstandings and practice the formula. They can think that oh, I'm acting in your best. I'm practicing integrity by trying to convince you, although trying to convince anybody is all generally antithetical to the formula, right? But it, people can believe in myths and nevertheless be trying to practice the formula. But what the formula does, when we look at justice, right, through the lens of relationality, it takes away a lot of like unnecessary complexity in conversations that makes it impossible for us to really understand each other, right? And what the right thing to do is sometimes, right? Where we just step back and say, am I engaging with this person and with this issue in a way that, am I treating this person, communicating with them? Is the information I'm sharing with them what I would wish they were sharing with me? Am I honoring their dignity? And if you answer yes to that, you are probably following a path that's going to lead you toward justice. And if you look at any like injustice, if you look at unjust systems, patriarchy, speciesism, racism, carnism, and so on, all of these systems, we could call them non-relational systems. They're completely organized around, the antithesis of the formula. We are socialized within these systems to violate our integrity when we're power holders, and harm the dignity of others. And we create insecurity and disconnection, and also on top of this, unjust power imbalances.
Yeah. And I think while the sort of epistemology isn't the focus of that process, it's a process and a formula about relations. I think there's some positive implications there, because if you are going to act with integrity, I would suggest that it would imply some degree of honesty. It would imply that if you want to act with compassion and resist injustice, you would want to understand reality in a reasonably accurate way so that you can engage with the world to do those things. And I think there's a flip side too, which you also talked about in the book, where it's often is actually false narratives and dogmas and falsities that are used to underpin the non-relational dynamics that we see. So in the same way as I talked earlier on about, some of the justifications for animal agriculture, they're not just don't care about those animals. It's actually some factual inaccuracies about how the exploitation is done, just as people who want to justify racism or sexism or casteism will, or other forms of discrimination, will often use, fake news or untruths or dogmas or outright lies to underpin their non-relational approach and to justify it. So again, I think there's both a positive link to the way you lay out the formula between epistemology and what that relational formula can mean. Yeah, but also the dangers of how broken epistemology and just understanding reality wrong, deliberately sometimes or inadvertently, is used to underpin some of the harmful injustices we see.
Yep, that's right. And the thing is about practicing the formula, right? First of all, you're right. This does imply that you're being honest, honest with others and honest with yourself, because you can't practice. I mean, again, it's treating somebody with respect. You cannot practice integrity towards somebody, if you're being dishonest. Lying to them is not the practice of integrity. And the other nice thing about sort of having at least some of the conversation around, working towards justice framed around relationality and the formula is that it gives us the opportunity to work toward to creating a more just world and a more compassionate world in our minute-to-minute lives. Because, often one of the things that I have learned for sure, I'll just say in my own life, and I've seen this happen a lot, is that the more I practice healthy relationality toward others, the more I hold myself accountable, basically, and the more committed I am to being like honest and objective, and rational in what I'm communicating. I'm like really notice myself. Sometimes I'll notice myself because I have an agenda and I'm trying to make a case and I'm trying to, whatever, I want somebody to get something and understand something important to me. I'll notice myself having an agenda in that conversation, and I'll notice myself like not being tuned in enough to what they're experiencing, not being curious enough about their experience. I can witness myself doing this. And because I know the formula and I'm so committed to at least trying to practice it. I mean, there are plenty of times when it's not possible to practice, or it's just very hard to practice it. That will give me pause. And I'll say to myself, like, okay, think this through, Melanie. Do you really mean this? Like, have you really thought this through? Are you really communicating, the accurate facts with them, or are you exaggerating because you want to create a response?
So you're saying that you're not completely free of motivated reasoning, cognitive dissonance, and bias?
Yeah. Well, if I had the formula for that, we'd turn it into a pill. But
I didn't expect you would be, even you.
not at all. But this is the thing. I mean, the more we practice this and build relational skills, the better able we are to engage with ourselves, to build self-awareness. There's this sort of myth. I don't know if it's a myth, whatever. It's this belief that a lot of people have that you can't love others until you love yourself. You might have heard that, right? So I wrote about this in Getting Relationships Right. And I was like, why? Like, where did this come from? It's one of those things that probably sounded really good when somebody said it. And it was like, oh yeah, yes, that's so profound. And it just stuck. But it's not necessarily true, as many new parents can attest to, or lovers. Like, many people learn to love themselves through loving others. The practice of the formula is the practice of love. It is acting in the best interest of the integrity of the other person, and which is always in the best interest of the integrity of the relationship and you. And that's another conversation.
So it's a process with positive feedback loops. It's not a sort of sequence or an end goal.
That's right. I mean, when you practice the formula towards somebody else, first of all, when a lot of people are much more committed to treating others in a loving way than we are to treating ourselves in a loving way. But we can learn to love ourselves through the practice of loving others, because loving, practicing the formula, however we want to put it, this is a behavior. And the more you do it, the better you get at it, and the more normalized it becomes to you. And when you do it in one area of your life, it starts to grow out into other areas of life. So, somebody, for example, who's struggling in a romantic relationship, in a marriage or whatever, a partnership, there's a lot of pain and suffering in this world among people in relationships, because it's really hard to have healthy relationships. And because most of us, I say this all the time, but I'll never say it too much, most of us have had to learn complicated geometry that we'll probably never need to use. And yet we don't get a single formal lesson in how to be healthy relational beings. And so, of course, we're born into a relationally dysfunctional mess of a world. And our relationships are like incredibly painful. And we're hurting people all the time and hurting ourselves. And so, there are people who will be willing, they don't necessarily care about other animals or about the world, but they certainly want to end the heartache and crushing pain they're experiencing in their marriage that's falling apart. And when they go and get help, if they do go and get help and build the relational skills necessary to heal their marriage, they've actually built a skill set that increases the likelihood that they will be able to hit the pause button and pay attention to what others are saying, whether that's others saying in, through the media or, whatever, through what they're reading. Look inside themselves, self-reflect, ask themselves the hard question, stay connected with their empathy, and act with more integrity. So it's really, really important that we commit to healthy relationality. And, also when you think about our social justice movements, animal justice or, justice for the climate or social justice, we're unfortunately cannibalizing ourselves in some ways, because this same non-relational mentality that I call it, doesn't stay compartmentalized. As we're working to end non-relational behaviors in the world, maybe we're vegans, for example, animal justice advocates, and we're trying to encourage people to change the way they relate to other animals. Nevertheless, we might be often are relating to other animal justice advocates in exactly the way that we're trying to stop people from engaging in the world. And our movements are kind of imploding in different ways.
Yeah. And it would be good to come back to that when we talk about how we can make a better world. But that also cues up the next part of the question, which is who matters? And in this context, I guess it's who gets to be in a relational relationship with us. And I think in a way, this is one of the most fundamentally neglected questions in moral philosophy, because they're so focused on, do we take a utilitarian approach or a deontological approach or a virtue ethics approach or a feminist care ethics approach or actually a relational ethics approach, that quite often people forget to think about the scope and who's actually included in this discussion in the first place. And one of the interesting things about those different moral philosophies, and this, relational moral philosophy is not the same as what you're talking about here with the distinct things, but they can link. One of the challenges to a relational moral philosophy can sometimes be that, look, if we're, for example, utilitarian and we think about well-being as a thing that needs to be maximized. That way of thinking, in a way, is forcing us to have a very broad moral scope, because any being that has well-being should count as we're, adding up in the spreadsheet the total well-being or whatever it is that a utilitarian wants to do. So that forces us to have quite a big moral scope. And one of the challenges to a relational moral ethic is that it might be, and actually to some degree a feminist care ethic, which has a strong relational element to it as well, is that it might be very positive and rich for those who are near us and like us, family members and friends and the people we interact with directly, and we maybe have obligations of care. But is there a risk that a relational approach makes us humans think, well, therefore I need to focus on those I have relations with, and we forget about others, whether those are other humans or other non-human animals? So I'm interested in partly your own journey for how you thought more broadly, but there's also a question in there, which is, if we think about taking a relational approach, how can we encourage people to think really expansively about who should be in relation with us, even very distant and very different beings?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say that the more relational you are, the broader your scope actually is.
That's part of the process.
Right. I mean, the more being relational means that you're empathic, even if you don't have like emotional empathy, you're more likely to be identifying with others. You're thinking beyond the self. You're not thinking in terms of the individual self and what do I want? You're thinking beyond identity in some ways, and your identity can be limited to yourself. Your identity could be your own in-group, whatever that may be, your family group, your nation, and so on. But that's not relational. Relational is not thinking in terms of like us versus them, defining ourselves based on what we're not. Relational is thinking whoever may be impacted by the choices that I'm making at this given moment, how am I impacting others in any given moment? I mean, obviously, I'm not saying walk through your day and constantly be like tied and twisted in knots, right? But relational thinking, that is relational thinking. I don't want to say other-centered because it's not other-centered. Other-centered is like the opposite of self-centered, but it's relationship-centered, right? We're in relationship with more than our immediate family members and more than our romantic partner and more than our own companion animals. We're in relationship with the world. We're in relationship all the time, with systems that we're a part of. And so when you think relationally, you're asking the question, how am I relating? Not just to the person sitting across to me, but how am I relating to the world? I need to buy some new clothes. Like, what does this mean? If you're thinking, what is the relational choice to make? Well, what is a choice, that is most likely to be respectful, that reflects my integrity, that's honoring the dignity of the beings who are going to be impacted by this choice?
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you. So as part of the process, there's an expansiveness built in and a recognition that wherever we have an impact in the world, we are, whether we like it or not, in relation with those beings, however different or distant. And do you think there's a boundary to that? Because some relational thinkers will consider that ultimately we're in relation with non-sentient beings, with non-living beings, that in a sense have a relation with this mug or with an ecosystem or with the earth as Gaia. Do you think that's productive, or are there dangers in going beyond the idea of relations with other beings that have their own experiences? Is there a distinction there?
Well, it's how you use the term. Like relational, the way that I'm using relational is to reflect practicing the formula, right? And so if you're relating, to relate means basically to interact. Probably by definition, it also means to interact or to engage in a dynamic, even if it's almost like, would a cup be in a dynamic with you? Well, anyway, you can relate to your cup, as you said, in that you can interact or you can act towards it. It's not acting back to you.
Can you do injustice to your cup? Or does your cup warrant dignity? I don't think so, personally.
In 200 years, maybe we'll find out that cups are sentient. I don't know, but I doubt it. So, no, I think that I would assume that most people would, use sentience or life, perhaps, as the defining factor.
Yeah, thank you. Well, let's come on in the time we have to this equally big and even tougher question about how can we make a better world. And in a way, you've been framing that to some degree already, because the answer is to take a more relational approach and apply that formula and apply that process, and to do that in an expansive way. And I guess I want to undermine the sort of premise of my own podcast here, because in a way, sentientism is saying, look, if we use evidence and reason to ground our epistemology, we'll have a decent chance of understanding reality as it is. So we're more likely to be right, and we're less likely to be led off astray by dogma and myths. So it gives us a better chance to do good in the world too. And if we have a moral scope that includes every sentient being that, in your terms, we are in relationship with, so none of them get disregarded, by definition, we're not going to be excluding any being that has the capacity to be harmed or to suffer or to be exploited or to be subject to injustice. So it's suggesting that there's a sort of combination of philosophy and science there that should be a good foundation that should help us make a better world. But through these conversations, it's often clear that, the philosophy and the science might be pretty obvious, but they're nowhere near enough. Like, the real dark heart of the problems is in your world, right? It's about human psychology and sociology and political will and social norms. So I guess I'm really interested in some of your big picture thoughts about how can we make the world better in that context? Because it seems like the raw material to me is, we have the good and bad of human psychology. And in a way, a lot of the good seems to be instantiated in younger humans. They seem to be quite naturalistic. They're like little scientists. They want to explore the world. They're trying to understand reality. They don't tend to have, too much fabrication or dogma until they're taught it. But they also seem to, and I don't want to be over naive about young humans, but they seem to have an intuitive, inbuilt sense of compassion and empathy and justice that you're, in a way, suggesting we should try and recapture and go back to. So there's good aspects of human psychology, but then there's all the challenging aspects. There's the cognitive dissonance and the wishful thinking and the biases and the normal, necessary, nice and natural stuff in the animal domain, of course, and more broadly, just sort of social dominance tendencies and what you've called powerarchies and this idea of hierarchies and structure and might makes right. So with that mixed raw material, how do you think writ large about how we can make a better world? And what do you think our chances are, I guess?
There are so many different avenues to come at the same problem or set of problems. And we obviously need lots of different types of change to be worked on from people who have experts in those areas, shifting economic systems. And there's so much that needs to happen. One thing that I believe is central, is helping people build relational awareness and relational skills. Because at the end of the day, when we think about policies and we think about legislation, we think about, these like big decisions that affect nations and the world, these are created by people, and if people are not thinking relationally, we're probably not going to have relational policies and practices and institutions. If our collective level of relational literacy weren't so low, like if we weren't still living in the relational dark ages, we wouldn't vote for, relationally dysfunctional leaders or like relationally toxic policies. It just wouldn't happen. So building relational skills is in my opinion, it's fundamental. It's not the solution to all of the world's problems, but it's got to be a critical part of any solution. And we don't need everyone to become highly relational. We just need enough people to be relational enough to shift the system. And I would say we need the right people to become relationally enough first. People in positions of influence, people who are already working to create a more relational world, learning how to do that in a way that's not creating the opposite outcomes of what they actually want. So, for example, people, as I mentioned earlier, people who already have an analysis around justice, people who already want to create a more relational world toward animals, non-human animals or the environment or humans. If these people learn to build, if enough people who are advocates build their relational skills enough, then our movements and people on the cutting edge of these important conversations will themselves be more relational. And a movement that's more relational, an organization that's more relational, is more resilient, it's more robust, it's more effective, it's more strategic, it's more likely to be successful. I could go on and on about this. And, if we think about it, we all have our sort of individual missions when we think about movements. And I'm, by the way, not even saying that social movements are the only solution to the world's problems. What I am saying is that social movements are made up of people who have already learned about in some form of injustice and made the commitment to work to end it. And some of these people are in really key positions of power. And so these are the people, who are sort of leading the way in some ways. It's really important that they build relational skills. So, the animal justice movement, and I do call the movement now animal justice rather than, I see the animal rights movement and the vegan movement and animal liberation as sort of sub-movements of what we can call more broadly an animal justice movement, because when you look at the psychology of justice and injustice and the structure of just and unjust systems, they're identical when it comes to animals experiencing justice and injustice and humans. I do want to make it really clear that I'm not comparing the experience of victims of injustice. I'm saying that the mentality that drives the injustice is the same.
The psychological underpinnings of common links.
The psychological underpinnings, exactly, and sociological underpinnings. So, so if a meta problem facing our world is relational dysfunction, and a meta solution is building relational literacy, then, we all share a meta mission in a sense. Anybody who's working to create a more just world has the mission of creating a more relational world. We might be working to create a more relational world toward non-human beings or human beings, but we all want a more relational world. And if we don't understand that and really know what that means, we're going to continue to trade one form of injustice for another as we work to create a more just world, because this non-relational mentality is contagious. It reproduces itself. And if you don't recognize it for what it is, target injustice at the roots, we're going to keep growing injustice even as we work to end injustice.
Yeah, thank you. So we can't just have an end that is relational. The way we do that and go about that and engage with each other has to be relational too. And I like the way you describe that, because one of the other challenges that sometimes comes through, looping back to the early part of our conversation about, I guess, the sort of Sam Harris focus on meditation and our own consciousness, is this caricature that, we don't need to solve the world's problems. We just teach everyone to meditate and they'll be happier. And there's a conspirituality version of that, which is about, manifesting a better reality and taking control of your own consciousness. And the real problem is in your own mind, which again is actually circling back round to quite a selfish, solipsistic stance. And your approach is very different from that, because by definition, that relational approach forces us into relation with others. And it also has a knock-on impact on thinking about the wider systemic forces that are, you mentioned, being interpersonally relational or intergroup relational isn't be all and end all. There's wider systemic factors and other stuff going on, but it plays into that in a positive way through the process you're talking about.
Yeah, well, I would say that Sam Harris does not advocate sort of going into a cave and isolating, or
no, he doesn't.
And he's very conscious of the need to keep sort of healing one's mind. And I do think he's right, where he says that the most important thing any of us can do is take care of the health of our own psyches, because this is exactly what I'm talking about. When we're not healthy psychologically, we are not able to make healthy decisions generally, and we are contributing to a lot of harm in the world. And so he does point out that the healthier you get as you work on yourself, the more engaged you will probably automatically become in helping solve some of the world's problems. And he's very strongly focused on this question in a lot of ways, which is one of the reasons I like his work. So it's not either or. We can sort of come at the problem from all these different sort of like entry points. But I would say that practicing healthy relationality, it's a piece of a broader whole. Practicing meditation and consciousness work is also a piece of that whole, because the healthier you are on a level of consciousness, or let's just say the more conscious you are, the easier it is for you to practice healthy relationality.
And given your deep knowledge of human psychology and sociology, what do you think our chances are of shifting wholesale to a much more richly relational approach across, ideally, not just humanity, but sentientity even?
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't. I couldn't even purport to know. I mean, I have found that, most people want to stop suffering and most people are suffering. And, relational tools provide people with a straightforward way to vastly reduce the suffering that they're experiencing and increase their ability to reduce the suffering of others. And most people who start to learn I do a lot of trainings and, obviously I've been writing and speaking about this, find that happens quite quickly. As soon as building relational literacy is not rocket science. So the good news is that most people—
It's in here, right? It's in here. We can do it. Yeah.
We can, the capacity is there. It's just like a matter of, learning and practicing the tools. So, if most people increased their relational literacy skills by 5%, we changed the world. So it's not a big ask. And it's something that most people really genuinely want to do. It's a matter of, people recognizing this and being made aware of it. That said, we're running out of time every day. We're closer to, ecocide. So I don't know if we're going to get there quickly enough.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been an inspiration. I think your book is going to be a great, healthy nudge for humanity to push us in a more relational and expansively relational approach. What's the best way of people obviously buying your book, but following your work more broadly? Where would you point people? I'll include the usual links in the show notes, of course.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll share some links. People could go directly to the book, How to End Injustice Everywhere. And they could also come to carnism.org. That's our website, Beyond Carnism. Just go to carnism.org and they can get the book that way. But there's they can also visit, I should say, our new website on how to end infighting, infighting.org. And the book has its own page on there as well. But I encourage anybody who's interested in reducing relational dysfunction in their groups and organizations and movements to visit us at infighting.org.
Apparently there is some infighting within social justice and animal justice movements. I've heard of it. I've never come across it myself, but
me neither.
Well, thank you again so much. It's been a genuine pleasure. And thanks for being a guest on Sentientism. Thanks,
you too.
Melanie.
It's been great. Thank you for having me.